Lecture 20 is also about the Quran. The text and arrangement is what we're going to be talking about, but we're going to be also talking some about how it was collated. In other words, how it was brought together, and one thing another, and how the Muslims, some of the sources of the Quran will mention that, and end up with some discussion about the use of the Quran in witness. Muslims would say that it is not situational, meaning there's no history in it. In other words, you can't say, well, Muhammad was here or there, and so he was doing this, and that's how we know it's true, because it's true historically. Well, that is hard to prove, because you do find Muhammad in various situations, and when you read the Quran chronologically, the way it was actually given to him, and we have lists of that, even though Muslims hesitated to go for it, yet when you look at a Quran, for instance, like Yusuf Ali, the meaning of the Holy Quran, you can see in an introduction to each surah that he will say this is early Meccan or mid Meccan or something like that. So Muslims do agree that there is some situational point to it. So it does help, by the way, to read it chronologically, because you then can understand it better. Muslims have had trouble with abrogation, and the law of abrogation is that some verses were abrogated because Muhammad, to tell you the truth, Muhammad realized that some things were different than they had been. And in other words, some things at the end didn't quite jive with the things in the beginning. So he recognized it, and there is a verse in 2 and 106 that says, none of our revelations do we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, but we substitute something better or similar. All right, Muhammad realized that he could forget, to put it in human terms. And so the law of abrogation came out. Muslim scholars are not agreed on how many verses are abrogated. Some say 100, some say 200, but it's the idea that the later ones abrogate the former ones when there's a contradiction. And this is the verse that they use, 2 and 106. Now, we can see how that would happen, because after all, Muhammad is human. And there are other indications that there were changes. In other words, things did not always, they were not the same. In 73, 1 and 4, there is some indication here that things changed. For example, they used to pray more all night, I guess, and then later on the prayers were limited to 5 times a day, and on and on. 16:101 is another verse that we could look at. It says that when we substitute one revelation for another, the word is ayah, and don't let Muslims tell you that the Quran is the revelation that displaces the Injil. That's not what is meant by this. It was a verse, ayah. It could be revelation, but it's wrong for Muslims to make that claim. When we substitute one revelation for another, Allah knows best. So it came about because there were some changes that came through Muhammad as time went on, and we'll look at those in a minute. What were the changes? Well, one of the changes was the Qibla, the direction to which Muslims look when they pray. In the beginning, they looked toward Jerusalem, because, as we've said before, Muhammad was pretty convinced that the Muslims, that the Jews, they would accept him and so on. But later on, when he was in Medina, and after he had realized that the Jews were not going to accept him, he whirls in the middle of his prayer as he's leading the prayer, and he faces Mecca. So that's one change. And there's a verse in the Quran 2 and 115 that says, to Allah belong the east and the west whithersoever you turn. There is Allah's countenance. So that's what the Quran says. There are other changes too, like the pilgrimage rites that were changed. They were implemented. In other words, if you look at 2:158, it says, behold, Safa and Marwa are among the symbols. So these are the two stones, and Muslims run back and forth between them when they're on the pilgrimage. This is something that was added later. The diet laws changed according to the Quran in 2:168. Retaliation is different. In the beginning, it seemed to be not so much retaliation, but in the end, there was against your enemies, against those who oppose you. It seems like in the beginning it wasn't true, but and also bequests or things like that, and fasting was changed. I don't think we said this, but in the beginning they fasted according to the Jewish fast, but then it changed and evolved into Ramadan. The 9th month became the fast month. This is some of the differences. And prayer was also changed in a sense that the 5 prayers came into being. That wasn't true in the beginning. In 73 verses 2 to 4, we've already mentioned that, but we didn't mention verse 20. Thy Lord doth know that thou standest forth to pray nigh 2/3 of the night, or half the night, or 1/3 of the night. So that was in the beginning. They did a lot of praying, I guess, and then it was cut down to someone. But a major difference was the sword verse. In the beginning, there wasn't this animosity against the enemies of God. But if you look at the Quran in chapter 9, there is, in the end, admittedly some difference. The sword verse is 9 and verse 5. It says, but when the forbidden months are past, then fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them. Or in that same chapter 9 and 29, fight those who believe not in Allah nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which hath been forbidden. So there is that difference. I think the Quran is, you can be a moderate and you can be a radical and still follow the Quran. You could, whatever you choose. In other words, you can choose the moderate, but the radicals quote these kind of verses. Every time they give a speech, they quote the Quran. I think that we would do well to support the moderates and their use of the Quran, because they would choose the warm and fuzzy verses. All right. What about collation? Well, there are 2 views here. There is the traditional view, the Orthodox view, and that's what we're talking, of course, about Muslims. And the Orthodox view, the Orthodox Muslim view, is that every year while Muhammad was receiving his revelations, Gabriel came down and examined the text. That's what they say. They say that there was no book, but there was no book at the time, but it was set when Muhammad died. This is the traditional view. It was set. And then they say that Uthman, the 3rd caliph, standardized, notice the term, standardized the text, the codex. Well, there is another view. Western scholars, by and large, say that it wasn't that simple. They say that at death, there was no collection, nor had anything been collated at all. There was not even a thought of it. There had been memorizers, yes, but nothing was set. And Uthman canonized his version, meaning there were other versions in other major centers of Islam. Other people too had memorized the Quran, and they had other versions, not quite the same. Muslims will deny this. They will say, no, not true. And what proof do we have that there were other versions? Well, one is that, thinking of a book by Arthur Jeffrey, the material for the text of the material for the text of the Quran, or something like that. Arthur Jeffrey shows pictures of the different codices. He shows that there were different manuscripts, and though Uthman tried to burn all other competing versions, he didn't do it, because you can go to the various museums around the world and find other codices. Muslims don't know about this by and large, but it's quite true. Another indication that you can find places in the Quran, like the Surah 53, where there are some verses missing. They're called the satanic verses. Now, that's the basis of Salman Rushdie's book, the satanic verses, because and that's why he was hated so much, because he was really talking about a sore spot among Muslims. But it's true that some verses were pulled out of the Quran. Now, let's get on to things that are not so controversial and confronting. The length of the Quran, well, it's 114 chapters, but noting that the Shia have 115 chapters, and by and large the Quran is 6,226 verses, about 80,000 words. Muslims will say that there are other scriptures. We've already talked about the other three, the Torah, the Zabur, and the Injil, the book of Moses, the book of David, and the book of Jesus. But Muslims will say that, there were other books as well, and they would sometimes talk about 104 books total. Adam had 10 books, Seth 50 books, Enoch 30, and Abraham 10. And so that's where the 104 comes out. One book that I mention here is a book by Ernest Hahn. He talks about, the title of his book is The Integrity of the Bible According to the Quran and the Hadith. We were into this last lecture quite a bit about how the Quran upholds the integrity of the Bible. We need to keep that in mind. Also mention here that the sources of the Quran are often non-canonical and sectarian offshoots of Christianity, like the infancy narratives. If you look at Surah 19, that's the chapter that's named after Maryam, or mother, the mother of Jesus. And that, by the way, is how they give the chapters a title. There's something in that chapter about, so on. It might be a lot, it might be a little, but that's how they came to give the title of the surah. And there are more than one title sometimes. And Muslims often don't talk about the number. They just say Surah Maryam or something like that. But there are stories in this chapter that come right out of the non-canonical offshoots of Christianity, like Jesus blowing on the birds and so on, and then coming to life. These are the kind of stories that were told. I don't know why, but they're non-canonical. They were not in the canon of Scripture, like it's sort of like apocryphal stuff. Or Surah number 5. These are the story again about the birds in the clay. Another one is the stories that have got into the Quran, like the 7 sleepers of Ephesus. Now, those are in the Quran, and indicates that Muhammad, when he heard these stories, he didn't know the difference. And in some ways, it's an indictment on the ones who told these stories. because there's a big difference between these stories that were being told and the actual scripture. But in 18 verse 8, it talks about the 7 sleepers of Ephesus. They were called the companions of the cave. And they slept, according to the youths, they slept in the cave, and they slept for 200 years. Something like our Rip Van Winkle story of these guys who slept in the cave for 20 years. These slept for 200 years, and the reason why the story was told among the Christians was that it's to show how quickly the time went. In other words, the 200 years of persecution between Emperor Decius and Emperor Theodore. Almost 200 years of severe persecution, but the time went quickly and it was over. That's the point they wanted to make, and that story is in the Quran. Well, it's not really scripture. There are other things too, like sort of like Aesop's Fables, the Arab version. If you go to the 12th surah, the one about Joseph or Yusuf, there is an embellishment in there. There is a that doesn't sound well. It's from non-canonical sources. They told the story, but they embellished it, and that's in there too. And Abraham too, something about him. Now, just keep that in mind, that there is a non-canonical source to the Quran. We have to be careful when we think about this in reference to Muslims, because they don't want to hear anything like that. But I think that the truth is that it's more of an indictment on Christians and the witness they gave that wasn't clear, wasn't God-honoring. They did not, I think, stick to the word as closely as they should have in the day of Muhammad. They didn't give a good, clear witness. What a rebuke, and what an importance to us that we should be sticking close to the word. We should know the word, and we should give a clear witness of the word, and not stray from it. Now, what do we do about the Quran in our Christian witness? We've already mentioned quite a few times in this course that you can use the Quran with integrity. You don't want to use it deceitfully, as if all it does is point people to Jesus and so on, because there are certain denials and so on. But we want to keep in mind that the Quran, God has used it in some ways. For example, the story of Laman Sana in Yale University from the Gambia, West Africa. He says that this is where he got his start. He was a Muslim, and he began to read about Jesus in the Quran, and this is how he was led to first look closely at Jesus from the Quran, and then we went on to look at Jesus from the Bible, and he was eventually led to believe in him. I know too of my friends in Pakistan who said that they became keenly interested in Jesus from the stories, from the miracles, from the raising of the dead and the healing of the lepers, and on and on. They realized that Jesus was very, very important, and they did some of them grope towards the light because of what they had read about Jesus in the Quran. And we have talked about how it's difficult to prove from the Quran that Jesus did not die. That means that Islam is harsher and harder in reference to Christianity than the Quran is. I believe that Islam has hardened, and